All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. I'm here with Conrad Hamilton. Good morning. Happy Sunday. Welcome to the Archimedean Point, episode number 3. We're very excited to commiserate with you all on this fine Sunday morning in late July. I think it is necessary to absolutely begin with the urgent situation in the Gaza Strip, where it was just reported by the New York Times that, in fact, dozens, an unknown number of Palestinians were murdered at the border in northern Gaza. This is happening every single day. The hunger and the famine has reached a true crisis point. So, I mean, I think that I just want to encourage comrades to donate to trusted charities. It's not too difficult to find charities as well as GoFundMes and different individual Palestinian families to support. I donated to Mohammed Suleiman's for his family to exit Gaza. That was successful. They made it to Australia, which was a miracle. So I don't know, Conrad. It's a situation which is of extreme urgency, and it's not the topic that we're going to talk about today. And I think that, in a certain way, we're talking about Marxist theory, socialist theory, but it behooves us to contextualize the most profound humanitarian crisis of our time. This genocide is, in some sense, unprecedented for the 21st century, without question. What's your take on the current situation in Gaza?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's one of those things, like I'm not specializing in that issue, as such. It's funny, right? Because I wrote a big thing about Russia and Ukraine, the apostate fascism of Alexander Dugin, but maybe in a way that was a little bit, I found it hard sometimes to say a lot that, was sort of politically nuanced in that way, because it seems like what we're seeing in a sense is so clearly, of course, there's lots we could talk about the political history and all that, but it seems like there's also something about it that's so fundamentally vile, right? That it resists these kind of clever recontextualizations, that are so characteristic of, leftist intellectuals, particularly, kind of in the online period. And I certainly, saw some people, you know, um, produce interpretations that I thought were quite strange. I know that, Chris Catrone's sort of position, for example, was that, we shouldn't support, the national coalition that's been forged, to fight against this, which of course is sort of Hamas led, but encompasses different groups, including PFLP and putatively leftist groups as well, on the grounds that, what really needs to be focused upon is the advocacy of labor struggles, right? Including, Palestinian workers, right, who are working in Israel, who are going to not be able to do that because of the current conflict. Um, but I found this all very, very strange, and really a case of like the worst kind of, economic spontaneism or whatever, because it really fails to grasp the dialectical interplay, between national and class struggles, right? And that's going to be an important theme for what we're talking about, today
Yeah.
with Losurdo and Althusser and all that. But I mean, even you can go look at Marx's, letter in the International Working Man's Association. They wrote, about Abraham Lincoln, and extremely praiseful. And Lincoln is a single-minded son of the working class. But Marx says something in that letter that I think is very powerful. And what he says is, um, essentially, only when the fetters of slavery are destroyed, right? Only when a new social world is created, right?
Mm.
Only when an enchained race is set free, will the beginnings of a new era of the ascendancy of labor begin in the United States, right? Because you had to abolish, right, those feudal, patriarchal, idyllic distinctions, right, that were preventing, right, the unity of the working class in that way, right, before this could happen. So I think you really have to, I think you really have to grasp that relationship. And of course, this is what happened in the U.S. in a way. I'm not saying the U.S. became, a socialist state, but obviously it was in the aftermath of the crushing of slavery, in the subsequent decades that you saw, the New Deal, and the rise of the Dirija state, and all those things. So one of these days I would like to write, because I often see that, like, we get stuck in this weird binary now of, like, national struggles versus class struggles. And I think there's a lot to be clarified with respect to the exact relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, often my reading of it is that, national struggles are absolutely decisive for creating anything like the conditions whereby you could have a working class that, exists, right, and is able to advocate for its demands at a more advanced level, right? So, even if you look at the experience of China, right, it's like China now has the biggest working class in history, right? So, maybe you're more or less generous in your assessment of the Chinese state, but I think that one thing you can say either way, right, is that they've been remarkably efficient, more so than, many states that were non-socialist, had less successful developmental projects, in generating those conditions of widespread proletarianization, right? So I think we really have to think about the relationship of these things critically, and I really hate, getting stuck in this, and I realize this isn't most people on the left. Most people on the left have been very supportive of Palestine, obviously. I'm just speaking to a kind of deviation in that respect. But I think it does speak, by the way, we're kind of tortured by this, this failure to fully resolve the class and national question.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think from a theoretical point of view, part of the problem, I think, is that anti-imperialist agitation meshes, you could say, almost with a kind of left populist orientation, where it does, one could accuse anti-imperialist activity as kind of doing the same error as you were mentioning with Catron's position a moment ago. Although I don't want to get into his position. I've debated Doug on this, on sublation. I've debated Chris on this. Yeah. We don't need to rehash all of that. I debated Spencer on this, or, conversed with them on it. So anyways, the point stands. We're here to actually introduce a very interesting essay by Domenico Losurdo, who, for folks that are not, like, aware of Losurdo, he died in 2019 of brain cancer. And it's very tragic because, in a certain way, he emerges as a sort of prophet for a new direction of socialism. And his work, from his counter history of liberalism to Aristocratic Rebel on Friedrich Nietzsche, an incredible political biography and balance sheet on Nietzsche, the most comprehensive work on Nietzsche's thought perhaps ever written. Not to mention his work on Antonio Gramsci, on Immanuel Kant. He has a wonderful book on Hegel and the freedom of moderns. So he has this, like, voluminous library of works. And the crazy thing is that if you look at Losurdo's actual biography of his output, he becomes extremely prolific starting really in his 50s. And he doesn't publish his first book until he's after 40. And one of the things we want to examine today is what is the life of and the intellectual trajectory of Losurdo in his early period as an Italian communist militant, as the editor of an important Maoist publication in Italy. He's known, I think, in a reductive way as a Stalinist, But I think that one of the outcomes of today's conversation is to sort of cast a bit of shade on that reductive sort of portrayal of Losurdo, and to show the way that different Marxist currents had a certain heterogeneous influence on his thought. And of course, the main thing we're going to discuss is this influence that Louis Althusser, the great French Marxist thinker, played on Losurdo. And of course, at first blush, it seems extremely surprising that Althusser would be of influence to Losurdo, precisely in the sense that Althusser's influence itself, as I've mentioned before, like, he was the Marxist that influenced Foucault, Deleuze, what we know as French theory. Frederick Jameson is basically an Althusserian. And so immediately we're left to assume that, oh, if you're Althusserian, that's kind of a French thing. It's sort of high theory. It's post-structuralism, right? So how is it possible that Losurdo, this vulgar Stalinist, is also deeply influenced by Althusser? Conrad has managed to disappear. Hopefully he will come back. But that's basically the topic that we wanted to discuss. The essay itself, published in 1970, is not translated. So we've done like a very rough translation of it. Conrad's actually working on an essay that sort of elucidates some of the main themes of this essay. But it's basically about how we can assess this question that Althusser addresses in his text For Marx regarding the epistemological break of the young Marx. And how does Marx escape from the Feuerbachian humanism, the radical humanism of his young period, and actually what was Marx's political position? As we know, the young Marx is basically reading the history of the French Revolution. He's reading Rousseau. He's reading the tradition of political philosophy. And he's developing a kind of imminent criticism of the legacy of the Jacobins. One of the things you'll see when you read Losurdo's work, whether it be his Nietzsche book, his book on Bonapartism, his book on Hegel, as well as this 1970s essay, is that he's very carefully piecing together the steps within the bourgeoisie after the revolution and its disillusion and the breakdown of its radical thrust. So he's constantly tracing the viability of the Jacobin position as a revolutionary position. As you all know, the Jacobins are kind of a bit odd in the sense that they usher in the bourgeois era, gloriously overcoming feudalism, promising, liberty, equality, fraternity. A type of new theory of political universalism is put onto the scene. The subject of rights, of bourgeois rights, the citizen, is this universal subject. It's deeply Rousseauist. But within about 10 to 20 years, the contradictions of early industrial capitalism erode the foundation of this universalism. And is an excellent concept that Losurdo develops in this regard of what he calls political nominalism, right? Which is the way that commodification over the sphere of political truths and values erode Jacobin universalism, right? And so Kant and Hegel emerge as figures that are sort of wrestling with this universalism brought into existence by the Jacobins, by the French Revolution. And of course, Marx is as well. And one of the big questions, I think, revolves around how is Marx treating Hegel's dialectic and the question of bourgeois humanism as an inadequate form, ultimately, of Christianity, right? And so this very interesting notion that Conrad hinted at a moment ago of this kind of the unevenness of different social forms, including feudal forms, that don't get fully eradicated in the wake of the revolution, right? In the wake of a social rupture, you still have slavery. So within the bourgeoisie, even though it prides itself on this universal rupture and break from the ancien regime, one of the things that Losurdo is extremely good at doing is showing the way that certain regressive social forms of domination and ultimately of slavery still persist. And so anyways, that's a bit of a topical overview of what we want to discuss. But Conrad, could you begin with a kind of overview of Losurdo's presence on the contemporary left before we get to his maybe biographical piece? Maybe you could just sort of dovetail into that. So in your piece, you talk about how Losurdo has sort of become a prophet of the post-2010s left. And why is that the case?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that in a way, it's like, you know, I think Althusser would be right with this, that you would have to look at everything in its conjuncture, right? So, you know, it's translated by Losurdo for a long time. I think the first one was Heidegger and the Ideology of War, right, by John and Morel Morris from 1992. But I think what we've really seen is that his reputation has kind of exploded for the past 5 years. And I think if you the reasoning for that, I would see it, you know, maybe appropriately in terms of, you know, the theory of overdetermination. I would think of it as indexing to a few factors. So I think that, you know, perhaps most decisively, we have the difficulties experienced by this kind of left populist project in this time that was, you know, reformist in character, right? Electoralist in character, and also harbored some of the illusions that you discussed, or that we'll discuss with respect to this piece in terms of, you know, how transfigurative a kind of radical democratic politics could be, you know, absent a real drive to transform civil society. Also had other things going on in that time, right? And, you know, I say on one side, I think that the left populist stuff, it was connected to, in many ways, to Western Marxism, right, as a kind of project, right? Because I think with Western Marxism, like, you know, it's even very clear if you go read Perry Anderson on this, right, where he says, you know, in a way, his book becomes a kind of program for Trotskyism, right? Trotskyism supplies the political dimension that was insufficiently developed in Western Marxist intellectualism. Right. So I think we always have to see Western Marxism, even if it's been most visible in intellectualism, as aligning with certain, you know, political moments. You know, and so I think there was a set of processes, right? Like in the 90s, I think that the initial goal of many Nazist groups and even some anarchist groups was to try to, you know, take advantage of the collapse of official communist parties. To position themselves as the real alternatives, as you will. That didn't succeed so much, but it became more relevant later on, because what you began to see later on, like in the 2000s and especially the 2010s, were these groups kind of organizing and forming coalitions and becoming more, you know, maybe populist, if you will, kind of vehicles that were a little more ideologically amorphous and experiencing more success at that level, particularly after the Great Recession in 2008. But it should be noted that you see some things even earlier, like the SWP in the UK, who experienced a lot of success due to the absence of an anti-war option when Tony Blair goes to Iraq, right? So, you know, you had you know, you had that sort of left populism that was in a sense intertwined with Western Marxism. We know that most of, you know, many of the major authoritative outlets of Western Marxism were giving support to Corbyn and Sanders and linking themselves very deeply to that project, which was also a kind of left liberal socialist coalitionism, right, in that time. And so that failed, and that failed very quickly, right? And especially from an English speaking standpoint. I mean, if we're talking a bit more globally, we could say, well, you know, Syriza in a way throw in the towel with their demands in like 2016. But I think it's like December 2019 that Corbyn experiences a defeat, and I think by Sanders it's April 2020. But then what's happening at this time is that, right? COVID, right? And COVID, I think, is important for a few reasons. And I think one is I think it creates this bubble in terms of kind of para-academic discourse. And, you know, this would be relative to the group that, you know, you and I both are administrators of, Capital Comrades, which was around in that time, which is discussed because some of those debates factor in Flowers for Marx, which we just published as well. But we had our own debates going there. But there's this big kind of, you know, a lot of debates occurring, which are occurring outside the context of more traditional institutions and mediums. And then to top it off, we have something going on with the response to the pandemic, right? Which is that, you know, while the US is allowing, you know, millions of people to die, right? Justifying it on the grounds of, you know, personal freedom, right? I love when Fox News brought out some old people and they were like, we're ready to die for young people's freedoms. And it's like, but this isn't really about people's freedoms, right? And it's about the reproduction of capital, right? You know, so all of that, you had kind of the worst cynicism. And then the US going and, you know, doing really not anything like what they should have in terms of helping provide vaccines and so on to poor nations, right? Well, at the same time, right, you know, China, for example, had a much stricter policy. And of course, with any kind of state of emergency, there's going to be a lot of problems and excesses, and, you know, it's not easy. To put things in perspective, I think by most estimates, if they had done that, you know, they would have been looking at a Holocaust-style death toll, right? Given the fact that they're not only a bigger population than the U.S., but also they're much more dense. In a way, it's like an ideal kind of environment for viruses and so on to flourish. You know, and then of course, ongoingly, before as well as after, you're experiencing this kind of new Cold War. Right now, at the same time as all this is happening, Losurdo's book on Nietzsche, right, which many think is his best book. I don't think it's his book that is the most widely read. I think maybe that belongs to liberalism, for example, which maybe a bit less of an obscure topic. But Losurdo's book on Nietzsche is translated, and I think that has a lot of positive publicity. And then shortly after, we have Western Marxism as well. But the Nietzsche one does seem to demarcate a significant shift in his reception, because I feel like the Nietzsche book, you know, is the moment where people kind of, even those people who'd been very skeptical, you know, a lot of people were like, we have to take him seriously now, because, you know, it's just about, you know, reprising or parroting the conditions of destruction of reason. You know, it's about the depth of the scholarship that he brought to that. Which I think is really quite unprecedented.
And he actually does divert from Lukács's claim that Nietzsche is the thinker of the stage of imperialism. Like, so he sort of gives a more composite and richer conception of the stages of Nietzsche's political thought that's more variegated than Lukács's.
Yeah,
Lukács is very much in this Leninist framework, which has its merits, of course, and is very valuable. But I think by no means, and even in the Aristocratic Rebel, he shows where he disagrees with Lukács's reading of Nietzsche. But as I tried to demonstrate, the two can definitely be put into dialogue, because one thing that Losurdo does not do, that Lukács does do, is that because Lukács is familiar with ontology and metaphysics, probably much more than Losurdo, he takes on Nietzsche's metaphysics, right? But what I think neither of them fully achieve is like the final nail in the coffin on Nietzsche from a Marxist point of view, which hasn't been done yet, which would be actually to go into Nietzsche's pure philosophy, right? What's really nice about the Aristocratic Rebel is that historical context that helps us see the way that our own present is still in a type of political continuity, that the project of communism and socialism has a certain continuity with Nietzsche's time. And the realization of that is, I think, extremely upsetting to the dehistoricized and apolitical portrayal of Nietzsche, right? So I agree with you on that. And I also agree that a lot of people haven't fully read Aristocratic Rebel because it's 1,000 pages. Matthew Sharp has a nice abridged version that I would recommend that was recently published by Historical Materialism. And Historical Materialism has also just put out all of these really, really important essays by Nietzsche specialists. Because, of course, when it comes to Nietzsche, his elitism is transposed into the academic community. And there is no a greater example of hierarchy and the fetishization of hierarchy than within Nietzsche's scholarship, without question. But despite that, many of the Nietzsche specialists could not deny the soundness of Losurdo's positions. So I'm underscoring your point. I'm even adding to it by showing that non-Marxists also found that extremely elucidating, and added to which all of the Deleuzians have never been able to forge a response to the book, for which they're in a state of infinite frustration and so on. So I agree with you on that point. And I think perhaps that dovetails to the position of Losurdo as entering into a kind of a philosophical driver's seat. Of course, we would have to analyze, like, why do we need a philosopher to be in the driver's seat of socialist thought and theory? And to some extent, I don't think that we do. And I'm not claiming that Losurdo is in the driver's seat, but I do think that he's playing a very provocative role right now. And can you say more about how you see his role?
Well, I mean, I think that, the reality is that, there's been a maybe underplaying within Western Marxism, within a lot of the books we've digested, within a lot of books that were germane to the promotion of the ideals of left populism, over the past, couple decades, maybe longer, right? So there's been a downplaying of a kind of anti-imperialist dimension, right? Realities of super exploitation, realities of the world, and things like this. And, we can see this if we talk different authors, right? So, I think even when Losurdo talks about Zizek, he says, well, at times, Zizek will take anti-imperialist stances that are very strong. At other times he will refuse them, right? Or he'll say, this really is distracting us from overthrowing capitalism, right? So there's a kind of distance he also takes from a more traditional Leninist hypothesis in that way. Obviously, we know Hart and Negri's thesis of empire, right, which implies a kind of global imperial hegemony, right, that's articulated across global financial institutions and so forth, and that precludes imperialism of the national type. And you can imagine that Stocks and Negri and Hart have kind of dived, right, with this new Cold War kicking off, because what people read theoretically is always responsive to the climate. But we can even trace it back further, right? If you go back to, after the end of the Cultural Revolution, if you go back to 1980, I think there was a book published by New Left Review by Bill Warren that sort of argues that, contra the Leninist critique of imperialism, that, imperialism has been successful in the sense of, American-led imperialism in terms of creating conditions for a kind of global proletarian flourishing. I might be vulgarizing a little bit there. I believe Samir Amin, the famous champion of delinking, referred to that publication as, quote, borderline racist. And indeed, right, there is something that's very questionable about it, right? Because people like to reproach Amin's thesis of delinking. Well, how could this be correct, in light of market-led development? But, he said, if we look at, often people say, well, 1 billion people have been raised out of poverty, right, in the past few decades. And it's like, well, if 800 million of them were in China, doesn't that raise certain questions, about, simple, porous free market development, right? I mean, Amin will say clearly, right, where he's like, China would never have been what they were, even in the sense of being able to capitalize upon, foreign investment and succeed to that level if they hadn't already had decades of delinking, right, development of development of education, extensive regulatory policy, and so forth. But all this is to say that, if you look at Losurdo, it's interesting, right? Because over the past 5 years, he's become strongly associated with this kind of anti-imperialist Marxism, if you will. And you can talk about the constellation of voices that are involved in this, right? Monthly Review, people like Gabriel Rockhill, Iskra, even in some way, of course, like Midwestern Marx and ACP. I'm of course not implying these are all the same diverse constellation of voices that articulate this in a different way.
Yeah, those are very different.
Yeah. But they share the basic motif, right, of this idea of like, to emphasize anti-imperialism in any case, right? Again, we can say the way some of them do it is highly objectionable. It's another.
It is, yeah, of course.
But so there's been sort of Losurdo in this context has become, he wrote, obviously the book was translated, Western Marxism, right? Become this kind of the ultimate slayer, if you will, of Western Marxism, the ultimate critic, right, of these kind of positions which waffle on anarchism. I think that's good, and I think it's good in the way that it serves as a corrective, right, to what has been a very, in a sense, one-dimensional and quite non-global conception of Marxism that's proliferated both in the political practice, that's been the most common in the West. Talk about the 2010s and populism, as well as in terms of what a lot of the biggest presses, have been putting out, the kinds of positions they have been promoting. I do think sometimes, and this is worth talking about today, I do think sometimes that it can cause us to look at the particularity of Losurdo's own political positions in life, which obviously cannot be, the particular kind of conjunctural role that he's played, right, in the past 5 years, that are a bit more expansive than that. So, Losurdo initially, he came from, I think it was near Bari, if I'm not mistaken, in Puglia, but he came from essentially like a peasant region of Italy in that time, right? And I think for a time he was associated with the Italian Communist Party, until the latter part of the 1960s, when he split and joined one of the Italian Maoist parties, and actually a few Italian Maoist parties. At that time, he was part of the National Editorial Committee for Novo Unità, which had been established a few years earlier, and that was sort of the major organ of the promotion of Italian Maoism in that period. And by the way, it's really important to stress the between Italian Maoism and French Maoism, because I think when we talk about French Maoism, we're always there was actually another party in France that was organizationally bigger, but we usually think about the Gauche Prolétarienne, right, the GP. A lot of Althusser's students were in that, most notably Jacques Rancière. And it was very urban, and it was very associated with kind of feminist, gay, migrant struggles as well, right? So very interesting kind of contextual interpretation of Maoism in that setting. But by the kind of advocacy that Losurdo was involved with, been more traditionally Maoist, if you will, because Italian Maoism actually had a much bigger link to the Italian peasantry, right? And in some respects, I was actually talking to Drew about this, and this is what he said. In some respects, while you could argue that, because it was opposed to the Italian Communist Party in a sense, and its assimilation to the Italian state, it was left of the Italian Communist Party. Drew suggested that on certain social points, it may have been to the right? Because it was actively needing to accommodate, the social context of a peasant demographic that it was also interested in achieving the support of or interacting with in that way. So that's all very interesting. Now, and I'm not I don't remember the names of every specific party. I'd have to go to the document and retrieve it here. But my understanding is that when the Cultural Revolution ends, he's expelled from the Maoist party that he was part of, and he joins another party run by a guy named Oswald that's very small. But I think that their basic position is that they're kind of staying with China, right? Even though China itself is drastically changing its policies, entering into a phase of heightened cooperation with the United States, introducing market reforms, so on. This is the Deng period. They're going to kind of stay with them. And, I think that also creates the possibility of a reconvergence on the Communist Party around the project of Eurocommunism in the late 70s. But it's very interesting because the sort of views on Marxism start to change heavily in this time. So, around this time, earlier, of course, he'd been a Maoist. Around this time, he begins to take the position that, well, in a way, quite contrarily, in a way, the problem with Marxist movement is they had been too Marxist, in the sense that they had been too focused on the sort of messianic break with capitalism, right? And what was really needed was to kind of build up, stable institutions in this context to reckon seriously with the tasks of governance, to develop a sophisticated social law, right? To incorporate rather than dispense with the axiomatics of liberalism, for example. So this is the other thing people forget, right? Because again, I feel like in the contemporary rendition of Losurdo, because his work has been juxtaposed with the liberal coalitionism of, kind of democratic socialism, left populism, right? Sometimes people frame him as the kind of ultimate anti-liberal. He wrote the book, that was sort of pro-Stalin, right? But there's also this very, very strong liberal dimension. Jordan, we see it in the way that he appraises humanism positively. We see it in, the way that he takes seriously kind of the constituent demands that Hegel establishes, right, for the state in the philosophy of right. We see it in the way that he sees Gramsci's incorporation and overcoming of liberalism, as you will, as post-liberalism, if you will, as really important to his development. So these are just the kind of things that get kind of forgotten about. But I think what's interesting, what really is the focus of the essay, which you were talking about, is that actually early on in Losurdo's career, he was, in 1970, he wrote, I think the most important piece that he wrote prior to publication of his first book in the early 1900s. He wrote a long essay that was published in a journal, Urbanati, or Urban Studies, called State and Ideology in the Young Marx. It's actually very influenced by Louis Althusser, right? And then you might ask, well, why would Losurdo have been influenced by this French philosopher, associated with, the idea of Marxist science and overdetermination and all of this? But I think you'd really have to understand, the particular situation. So, if you really looked at Italy at that time, Italian, French Maoism had a kind of intellectual luster associated with it, right? You had intellectuals who, maybe they were not direct partisans, but they had some kind of connection, direct or indirect. People like Michel Foucault, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, people like, as we'll see in a minute, Althusser. Whereas Italian Maoism didn't have that kind of intellectual luster. And actually, most of the major Italian intellectualism would have been associated with the anti-historicist wing of the Communist Party. So people like Della Volpe and Coletti, or it would have been associated with autonomia, right? People like Tronti and Pensieri. How anachronistic it is to suggest that autonomia was actually important in that time to most Marxist reading is another question. I argued this with Drew. So the point is that Losurdo was looking for someone, right, to kind of use. And, Althusser was the person he went to. And there is a link, right? Because again, many of Althusser's students went to the Gauche Proletarienne, but also we know that Althusser had this influence, right? We know that contradiction and overdetermination, the thesis of the overdetermined contradiction is deeply influenced by Mouzon contradiction. We know that he had been considered part of the final wing of the French Communist Party. I think he was offered to interview Mao, but turned down 62 or 63 or something like that. We know he'd been very sympathetic to the Cultural Revolution, right, as the type of project of remobilization that he was advocating for in France, obviously under very different conditions, but he was very sympathetic to that, right? So, I think you can understand in that way why he does this. Now, the essay itself is really good, by the way. It's very rigorous. It's very interesting. And the main thing he deals with the essay is it's kind of an engagement with the famous periodization that Althusser has of, Marx, and again, he revises it later, but the famous periodization, according to which Marx has this epistemological break in 1845, the years of transition, but, it's really the Son Feuerbach and the German ideology that inaugurate, right? Marx of, formations, relations of production, modes of production, as opposed to the realization of the immanent essence of man and the overcoming of alienation, right? In that way. So that's very much this point in his career. That's very much the scientific Marx, the Althusserian Marx, is very much the Marx that Losurdo aligns himself to. But he has a slightly different periodization than I. And this is what the essay is dedicated to. Because whereas Althusser saw 1845 as this decisive split, for Losurdo is like, look, if we look at the earlier Marx, he's actually way more anti-humanist than we'd given him credit for. And not in the sense that he explicitly, right, adopts an anti-humanist position, because the first intimations of that in a more explicit way we only see in the German ideology, right? But in the sense that he effectively problematizes it, right? Through showing how the category of the individual or the view of society as simply consisting of an aggregate of atoms that the state has to mediate is already a very specific worldview devised in the context of capitalism, right? So a big thesis in the essay is, how does Marx's view of the state fundamentally differ from other views of the state, especially Hegel's view of the state? Because Hegel's, in a sense, the most important, because Losurdo stresses that while Althusser talked early Kantian Fichtean, in a footnote, Kantian Fichtean Marx, Losurdo says in a way Marx was never a Kantian Fichtean. He was really a Hegelian in a way when it came to the state. Because the thing is, if you look at the sort of Hegelian view of the state, what the description of it Losurdo provides is that it's based on the idea that the state can rise above, if you will, right, all of the forms of exploitation that exist within it, right, whether it's, the market, whether it's the family, that it transcends them in some fundamental sense. Right, and going back to, essentially Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, but there are many texts, letters as well, that he draws on. The case that Losurdo kind of makes is that, what Marx shows is that this is a reversal of subject and predicate, if you will, right? That it is not the case that the state is the primary term, right? The state is the superstructure, right? To use somewhat anachronistic terms in the philological history of Marx, but yes, the state is the superstructure. And what the state really arises to do is to reinforce and provide and legitimize, right, those forms of exploitation which are imminent to civil society, right? So, of course, we see this spectacular exploitation of laborers by capital, right? And yet at the same time, we're told that, everyone, not everyone in that context, but you get the idea, there's a universal conception of man, right? Your individual subjects, right? In this sort of setting, right? And this is a lot of what Losurdo's critique revolves around, right? Is this idea of, individual atomic subjects who, through a kind of conspiration of their wills, right, will produce a better outcome, that kind of invisible hand style hypothesis, right, which also, reinforces the idea of egoism as necessary to the functioning of the state. And he finds this even in Hegel, right? You know, in the philosophy of right, the insistence on the importance of, quote, subjective selfishness, right? But what he sees, and this is what he wants to stress, is a very fundamental shift, right? Where Marx, you know, and we can talk about the view of Kant, we can talk about the view of Rousseau, we can talk about the view of Hegel, where Marx breaks with this, right? And this has implications as well, right, for how he perceives the functioning of ideology. I do have to say that my favorite part of the essay, it comes near the end, and in that part, he talks about a debate that Marx had with Arnold Ruge over the textile strikes that were going on in Silesia in the summer of 1844. And, you know, Ruge, what happens is you have these strikes, and the Prussian state at the time, they're only able to intervene based on the appeal or injunction to Christian charity. And Ruge looks at this and Ruge says, look, this shows like how underdeveloped Germany is, that we're faced with this real social problem. And we respond in this kind of feudal way, you know, charity, Christian generosity. And Marx says, no, the symptom of our underdevelopment is not that we can't grasp, right, the real social problem. The symptom of our underdevelopment is we're so naive as Germans, because the state is so underdeveloped, that we really think that in a more advanced bourgeois state, right, that social problems would be more transparent, or they'd be less obfuscated by ideology, right? And Marx says, look at England, that paragon of progress, right? You know, there you have, you know, horrific ideologies that are conceived to disguise the reality of social evils. You have a colossal attribution of issues which are really problems with the economic base to the superstructure of politics. And this is one thing Marx stresses, right? That the more sophisticated a bourgeois state becomes, in a sense, the more insidious the ideology becomes, but also the more sophisticated it becomes in attributing the problems of the base to the superstructure, right, in that way. So, you know, from there, Losurdo kind of, you know, and there's some parts in here too that are very important, where he talks about the limitations of radical democracy, as well, as you were saying about the Jacobin project. Because one of his real points here is that, you know, the fundamental failure of the Jacobins was in imagining that the state could be piloted, right, to represent the interests of the insurgent classes, you know, without there needing to be a true recontextualization of civil society, or transformation of civil society. Even use the word destruction, I think Losurdo does. But, you know, he relates this to the history of socialism as well, right? Because he sees certain people in the history of socialism as having reactivated this statist kind of perspective, right? So he talks about in particular the LaSalle, right, as being one of the figures, right, you know, who reintroduced this idea of the state, you know, bourgeois political state, as a medium that was appropriate to the advancement of the proletariat. And then we see it in what was the name of the famous reformist in the German social democratic movement, Daniel? You know the guy I'm talking about?
The Bernstein.
Right. That's right. Yeah, and which we see also in Bernstein. Right. This kind of idea. So you know, part of this philologically, and what he's trying to do is he's trying to insist that, you know, Marx never entertained that notion. Right. It's essentially exogenous to the Marxist tradition, and in the end, he draws some conclusions from that, and he says, like, you know, the typical function of delineating like an early humanist Marx is to provide you know, an instrument with which kind of democratic socialists or social democrats can browbeat Marxist-Leninists, right? Oh, look at the early Marx, the nice humanist Marx. And he says that, you know, on that basis, it's kind of understandable that somebody like Althusser, you know, would seek to gravitate towards the works of Marx, which are more emphatically averse to those kind of conceptions. But he said the problem is ultimately it amounts to sort of the same gesture, the same operation, because we shouldn't just concede the young Marx, right? He said the real way to overcome this is to show that, you know, this was, there's a consistency in the trajectory, right? Where critiques of humanism that were at first, you know, sometimes even issued on the basis of humanism itself, become more emphatically and directly expressed,
Right.
or concisely expressed in the later work. So that's the basic
Yeah, that's
idea.
great. All right, good. Let me say a few things in response here. I think that's a great overview of the essay. Again, we're talking about Losurdo's 1970 essay on state and ideology in the young Marx. Curiously, Losurdo says that this is an essay of his youth, and he sort of subsequently discards its importance in his wider oeuvre. But I think Conrad and I want to make a claim that it's actually extremely essential to his wider body of work, not only because of the curious influence of Louis Althusser on his thought at this time, but also it represents something far more objectively systematic from a scholarly standpoint that makes it actually, in a way, a little bit better than his book Hegel and the Freedom of Moderns. One of the things that he does achieve in Hegel and the Freedom of Moderns that I really found interesting is, of course, he has this whole theory that Hegel self-censors in the philosophy of right over this term, which is related to similar struggles of the proletariat to the textile struggles that Ruge and Marx were debating. This kind of like peasant uprising of the plebeians. And one of the questions about rights, the rights of the poor, I think the term is Notrecht, Notrecht. And in the philosophy of right, the published text, Hegel does not fully embrace it. But what this term refers to is that, and this is very much immediately related to Gaza, in fact, which is that one is permitted to destroy property on condition that their needs, it's Notrecht refers to the rights of need and survival. One is permitted, I think, the use of violence and the destruction of property on condition that they're facing profound deprivation of need and hunger. And Hegel fully endorses this for the proletariat, even though he's not using that term, but let's say for the working class. And so Losurdo shows that this is an example of the implicit political subtlety and radicalism of Hegel. And moreover, he shows in this 1970 essay that Hegel's embrace of the state has to be understood in relationship to the fact that it was also, Hegel's implicitly in favor of continuing the process of the French Revolution that it opened, and B, Hegel is also leaning on a conception of the state for an implicit rebuke to the anti-statist position of the feudal ancien regime, which was making a comeback. And he says, moreover, this is why Hegel moves away from social contract theory and Rousseau, because reactionaries had already begun to overcome and use and pervert social contract theory. And then finally, one of the interesting ways to read the philosophy of right, of course, is through the fact that Hegel's students, by and large, become socialist ideologists. Yeah. And that's the left Hegelians. That's Feuerbach. Feuerbach becomes the pinnacle of that. And it's out of that milieu that Marx develops, according to Losurdo, and I want your take on this, an early theory regarding the inadequacy of the petty bourgeois socialist ideologue, right? Whereby, in essence, and you see this reflected in the critique of Feuerbach in the theses, but in essence, the idea that Marx has at this time is that the petty bourgeois intellectual cannot help but think of the social antagonisms of bourgeois society through the prism of ideas. And so what you get is kind of like an imminent critique, which would become very pronounced, of course, in the Communist Manifesto of all existing intellectuals, in socialist intellectuals, right? Proudhonism, true socialism, utopian socialism, Moses Hess, religious communism, the young Hegelians, and down the line, right? So that I found extremely useful because, again, what actually are they missing is the way that the class struggle is usurping the promise that the relationship between civil society and the state can, in fact, be sustained by relying on anything other than revolution. In other words, revolution becomes kind of the mandate. And this, I think, becomes the fundaments of the revolutionary thrust of Marxism itself. And I think that Losurdo's point, and I want to invite you to say something about the debates on science here, because we know from Western Marxism later, right, more recently, that the problem with Althusserian anti-humanism revolves around the way that it actually fails to adequately get at a form of revolutionary humanism that is strategically necessary for the global South and for anti-colonial struggles. And, you know, we elaborated this in our study group on Losurdo's Western Marxism and some of my lectures on that, where he develops the notion of the multiplicity of struggles, right? But what do you say about science and Althusser's conception of science? How is Losurdo responding to this idea of science? Obviously, he's not following in that kind of French Bachelardian tradition of epistemological ruptures and breaks, right?
Mm.
But as you said, he's also recognizing that Marx possesses a profound critique of humanism. But what would you say Losurdo's position is apropos science?
Right. So, I mean, it's not entirely clear to me in the 1970 essay. He seems to be certainly open to the project of a generally scientized Marxism, but at the same time, we see this, you know, tension with Althusser's particular periodization, which is interesting because it also opens the door to the possibility of a revolutionary humanism. Because if the early Marx was humanist, but revolutionary, right, or critical of the abuses of humanism, right, or the use of it to repress social conflict, then, you know, we need a more sophisticated position than a pure negative. I think that's already implicit in the 1970 work. Now, later, obviously, his position develops, and, you know, in very interesting ways. Like, I was reading a quote that he provided, I think in the 1980s, and he was saying, like, well, you know, if you look at China, you know, you can see that respect for human dignity has achieved like a far greater premium today in the context of the Dengist developments. But with respect to Althusser specifically, yes. So later he'll come out strongly in defense of Marxist humanism. He makes a few different arguments for that. You know, one of them has to do with the idea that, you know, to say that Marxism is a science treats it's Eurocentric and elitist because it treats it just as a chapter in the development of European sciences, which I'm a little bit skeptical of for the simple reason that I think there's a hidden premise there about the idea that treating something as a science or being methodologically self-subsistent would imply denying its social history. For example, like I can believe like George Thomson or Alfred Sonnreithel that mathematics came from, you know, commodity exchange, you know, and markets in ancient Greece, but that doesn't require me to deny the methodological subsistence of historical materialism, which is to say that, and in a way, it actually honors those struggles more, because it's like, you know, you created a science, right? I mean, like something that being applied to all places, right? You know, to explain there. There's another one that's kind of more conventional and philological, which is that you know, Marx continued to express humanistic sentiments in later works, which is true, and fair enough. Though Losurdo doesn't really go through like the more extensive work of tracing out all the changes to Althusser's periodization, which is maybe understandable because it's, you know, a bit of a head fuck. When he starts talking about how like Critique of the Gotha program and Notes on Wagner are the only true scientific works, like, okay, we want to be Foucault here, okay. But the most famous one is the one you're talking about, right? Which is the idea that you know, Althusser doesn't, you know, he's responding to a context in which you know, the idea of universal rights of man, you know, the provision throughout society, is, you know, obviously related, much as we talked about COVID earlier, to the defense of property, to the defense of the development of capital, and that's being used to encourage revisionism or justify revisionism within communist parties. It's also being used to cause a moderation in the overall trajectory of the USSR. And interestingly enough, Losurdo, he's like, that's fine. He's like, Althusser's, even later, right? Losurdo's like, Althusser's right about that, right? Because, you know, and that's interesting too, by the way, because it tells us that he never fully disavows his early positions, right? You know, that he sees them as being kind of in continuity, right? So I don't think Losurdo would say you know, he might have said he did an about face on Althusser, but I don't think he would see himself as having done an about face on all those ideas. But what he does say is that the problem is it's insufficiently broad, because, you know, yes, humanism may have been abused in that context. It may be abused in many contexts to water down the left or encourage a kind of weak interclass agenda, you know, as well as to propagandize against communist states. He links it to Gorbachev's surrender, I quote. But then it's like, it also has this very emancipatory function, right? He talks about how in Shanghai, where I am here, maybe you can't recognize it because it's just a room, but yes, this is the famed British European colony of Shanghai, you know, created in order to financialize the flows of opium that Britain was selling to the Chinese to get them addicted, created in India. HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Company. So he talks about how in Shanghai, you know, in the French concession in this time, there were signs that said, you know, no entrance to dogs in Chinese, right? So when Mao Zedong, for example, talks about the importance of the human factor, right? You know, who says people, only people in the long run can make history, right? You know, these kind of humanistic phrases, they're also being wielded against a colonial context that was aggressively dehumanizing, and not just by Europeans, you know, even worse later in a way by Japan, right? Who'd adopted, you know, Yamato race theory, European style racial doctrines as well, right? So, you know, and you can talk about many contexts in which it was employed this way. Obviously, you know, Black struggles in the United States, right? You know, not just the Civil War, but later the Civil Rights Movement. You know, speeches by people like Martin Luther King, and so on. So, you know, and this isn't an unequivocal critique actually, because he acknowledges that Althusser actually says at times, like, well, humanism could be maybe useful under certain strategic conditions. We see this in Marxism and humanism, right, where he doesn't disavow the idea of humanism as strategy rather than science. We also see it in Reading Capital, which is the text that Losurdo cites, where Althusser refers to Gramsci and Luxemburg and a few others as representing a strand of revolutionary humanism, right? And Althusser, you know, that's the other thing about Althusser, right? So, like, you know, he can sometimes see things as historically productive, even if they're not scientific. I don't know if people appreciate that about him. But here, what he kind of sees is he talks about Gramsci's phrase, because Gramsci said the Russian Revolution was the revolution against capital, right? And Althusser, for him, it's not really the revolution against capital. It's the revolution against the Second International, the fatalistic reading of capital, right? The teleological reading of capital. But his point is that idea, right, the revolution against capital, right, this revolutionary humanism became a productive placeholder pending a rereading of capital that would be worthy of the kind of break or rupture that Lenin accomplished. But you know, so Losurdo actually acknowledges this, which I think is good. And people forget, by the way, how generous a reader he can be at times too, because he can be very ruthless, but he can also be very giving, you know. It depends.
Right. I mean, it's very striking because, you know, one of the things that Losurdo is able to pull out, and I think this is a testament to his kind of precise scholarly maneuverability in the archives, is he extracts letters that Marx will write, say, for example, when Marx is writing the class struggles in France, where I forget which young Hegelian he was writing to, but he says something along the lines of, once 1848 actually kicks off, right? European society, the ideologists, this goes back to this notion of petty bourgeois ideology, which I want to elaborate on further because I think it's very important, still would lean on these distant ideals of, say, fraternity. And what does Marx call fraternity at the moment of this revolutionary moment? He calls it synonymous with civil war, right? So there's a way in which Christianity becomes the harbinger of this kind of latent incapacity to achieve its own ideals of the kingdom of heaven, its own ideals of emancipation. It becomes fundamentally reactionary. And that Christianity, therefore, is sort of inextricable from bourgeois ideology. And so Marxism becomes this sort of question of an imminent critique of left-wing intellectuals that is extremely critical of humanism and all of its versions and instantiations. One of the things that Losurdo will develop in his mature work is the notion that forms of recognition struggle persist beyond the primary contradiction of bourgeois society, of capitalist society, between labor and capital, and that we have a heterogeneity of struggles, and subsequently, say, the women's struggle, the anti-colonial struggle, etc., give birth to the necessity of oppressed groups. And he shows very nicely, I think, very nicely, that this is a through line throughout the Communist Manifesto of this notion of a multiplicity of class struggles in their plurality also imply the importance for the Marxist ideologist to think beyond the purview of the immediacy of sort of bourgeois. So I get this sense that what's valuable about this is that we already have a kind of anti-imperialist necessity of the left-wing intellectual to think the way that the capitalist system is a global conjecture that is a kind of vortex of a multiplicity of struggles. Now, one of the things we've struggled with is the meaning of recognition for Losurdo. On the one hand, obviously, we know that the origin of recognition struggles comes from Hegel's phenomenology, the Lordship and Bondage chapter, for which there's all sorts of mostly liberal critiques of recognition, whereby this becomes the highest ideal of bourgeois society for kind of mutual recognition and the ending of the master-slave dialectic. And I think that Losurdo wants to revitalize a kind of communist commitment to recognition. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts on that. I know you're a bit critical of Losurdo on recognition, and I'm a little critical myself, but perhaps you might lay out some of your views on this.
Right, right. So this is going to get us. So one thing I think that's important to do in my essay is that I think that Losurdo definitely has a point when he talks about Althusser's failure to appreciate the breadth of the way that humanism could be applied in different contexts, as well as more generally the way that political symbols and terms are very amorphous, right? You know, they're subject to change and recontextualization. So I think he has a point about that, but I also think it's very important to look at what Althusser, how he might respond to that. And, you know, for me, this is linked to the problem of recognition as a concept. Because I guess the way that I see, if we look at a book like Class Struggle, which has, chapter 4 deals a lot with recognition, I guess the way that I see the concept of recognition is it's a little bit like, a classically ideological term, in the sense that it becomes a placeholder, that doesn't, in the absence of more developed ideas. So, if you look at Class Struggle, one of the problems with the text, in a way, is that, there's a certain lack of analytical content in the categories, right? Because if you really look at, like, the women's struggle, or you really look at, colonial struggles, are these really not economic struggles? Or is it that we've conceived, the way that economy functions too narrowly in a lot of respects, or too ideologically, right? So if we look at something like socially reproductive labor, right, and the way that's used within capitalism, or we look at value exchange within the world market, and so on and so forth, there's nothing about this, I think, that really, to me, is that persuasive of the fact that we need recourse to the category of recognition to explain it. But I do think that sometimes, I think that Losurdo, in spite of usefully highlighting the importance of these different struggles, that he doesn't always flesh them out as much as we might hope. And to be clear, that's an ongoing process, right? I mean, I personally think that a lot of the reason why this sort of Foucauldian approach took root, power, right? I realize it's more complicated than that, but we'll say power. Okay. I think a lot of the reason that took root was because of, a failure of the framework of Marxism to sufficiently explain things that have the term recognition attributed to them in Losurdo. Again, with respect to the economics of imperialism, with respect to the economics of Marxist feminism, which received a big impulse in Italy. We have books like Lise Vogel and everything now, so there's been a lot of strides in that respect. And I think that contributes to what I see as an element that if Althusser were looking at class struggle, he would object to, because we have a similarity in an Althusserian aspect in class struggle, which is the idea of the overdetermined contradiction, right? It's not like a simple contradiction of capital and labor, right? You have national struggles, women's struggles, class struggles, okay. And by the way, Losurdo, when asked about this, he would say, like, well, he doesn't deny he's influenced by Althusser in that aspect, but he says, like, look, the best stuff with Althusser didn't really come from Althusser, came from Mao and Lenin, and but I think part of the problem here is, remember what humanism is for Althusser, because for Althusser, humanism is something that is an ideological guarantee. It's the idea that, without an emphasis on particular struggles for emancipation, without concerted efforts to change the relations of production, things are going to be okay, right? This even goes back to the point about the sort of logic of the invisible hand, or the fable of the bees that Losurdo highlights in his essay, right? So Althusser will even see Stalinism as, in a way, humanist, right? The idea of man, the most precious form of capital, humanist motifs in the 1936 Soviet Constitution. The idea that humanism was used to justify this narrow focus on the development of the productive forces, right? That didn't take an adequate account, or sort of took for granted, okay, well, it's going to work out, right? Thereby falling into this kind of trope of, which we find in sort of bourgeois liberal thought, right? It's all going to be okay, visible hand. So I think that if Althusser were going to critique class struggle, that's the way he would critique it. And he would say, like, in a way, the problem is that, these struggles are too easily foreclosed by the state. And the latter part of the book, I think, is largely a conversation about China.
But I also want to add one thing here, which is, I think, implicit in the recognition struggles concept itself. You'll remember he also wields it as an imminent criticism of what we would today call some variant of class reductionism in Marxism. Famously, in Western Marxism, he will say that Italian autonomia and Tronti, for example, in their refusal to think any relation or prioritization of the anti-colonial struggle, the Vietnam War is happening, etc. At this time, they're emphasis is purely local, and this gives rise to what Losurdo sees as a abuse of Marxism, precisely because when capital as a total system of domination enters an imperialist phase of that domination, the only way to stay true as a Marxist critic and revolutionary would be to think the heterogeneity of these struggles, on the one hand. On the other hand, to also recognize and not fall sway to a brute reductive empiricism, or like some kind of fetishization of one suffering over the other, etc. And I'm not going to entertain the idea that this is supplantable to sort of intersectionalist theory, because I don't think that it is. But it's something close to a very important contribution that Losurdo, I think, gives to our contemporary struggles, right? And even some of these things we were talking about today, about how socialists are thinking Gaza in relationship to domestic class struggles, etc. And there is also, final point would be some perhaps sense that what we miss by, and now here we would have to, I think, invoke this thing that Losurdo hints at is going on in the early Marx between primary and secondary contradictions. I don't see Losurdo as trying to necessarily carve out a strong claim that imperialism becomes the primary contradiction and we should then subordinate, because that would be playing the reverse of the game that Tronti was doing, that he's just now criticizing in a certain way. You see my point? So perhaps you might say something about this notion of primary and secondary contradictions for Losurdo. Because again, at the moment we're talking about him, he is some kind of unreconstructed Maoist, right? So, because he does mention in this essay on the young Marx that the young Marx has kind of like a conception of primary and secondary contradictions going on. I was wondering how you thought that through.
Right. In the sense that he makes, he understands that the state would be a secondary contradiction, or politics would be a secondary contradiction, which doesn't,
right?
And this would be the mistake of the Jacobins.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But then he gives a certain benefit of the doubt to the Jacobins, because he says, well, like, they didn't have the same society, it wasn't developed the same with the same advanced theoretical means at their disposal. Yeah. So I would be concerned when it comes to the later work that, and I don't think he ever like expressly says, oh, these don't matter, but there is a method of rationalization in terms of, the needs of the state, the need to consolidate itself, contra the West and all that. And like, we have to take that very seriously. But I do think that, it's a complex issue. Like, even if you look at, China, for example, like, how do you respond to the situation with organized labor? Do you say, oh, it's bad if it's repressed? Do you say, well, does the fact that, this has been essential to attracting foreign investment, which has raised the value of labor power, and the quality of life within the context of an extensive regulatory policy, orchestrated by a socialist state, does that matter? So these are actually like super complicated questions.
Right.
But my only point about, recognition is, like, to be clear with the comparison with Tronti, I appreciate, I guess, the rigor in a sense of Workers and Capital. But I also think it's like a terrible book. I mean, like, I think somewhere in that book, he says that the Italian wildcat strikes of the 60s are more important than all of the post-colonial revolutions.
Yeah, I think Losurdo quotes him on that one. I think.
Oh, does he? That's such a, I noticed that as well. Yeah, that's such low-hanging fruit, right? It's like, oh my God, that's probably the dumbest thing I've ever seen written.
Yeah.
In a major work of Western Marxism.
So that's helpful. I feel like we also need to address the theme that we wanted to bring out from this, because one of the things that we're trying to argue here, and I want you to elaborate on this, Conrad, is that implicit in the young Marx is a certain kind of germinal theory of the state in relationship to civil society that has a lot of applications to the contemporary American state. And I think we should pivot to kind of an elucidation of that argument, that thesis, and see where that takes us. And then I want to move on to something else. But let's actually, so the recognition piece, folks can go back and look at our study groups. I did 2 or 3
Well, to be clear, let
videos
me say this though. All I want to
ahead.
say finally about recognition, it would be better to have the category of recognition in the way that Losurdo uses it than to be Tronti, right? Because at least then we have the multitude of struggles recognized at an ideological level. You know, but you gave the comparison with intersectionalism, and it is relevant because what's the Marxist critique of intersectionalism? This plus this plus this. Now, I'm not saying that represents all of Losurdo's work, but I am saying that, you know, I would rather see it woven into, you know, a deeply understood economic totality,
Yes.
than approached on that level. Yeah.
That's exactly right. It's about the capacity for thinking the social reality of capitalism as an internationally interconnected system of domination, which takes on these multiplicity of struggles. It's not to say that the women's struggle, the anti-colonial struggle, or etc., are somehow fully subtracted from the relationship between the overarching domination of the contradiction of labor and capital. They're still determined by that, but the subjectivities are also facing the achievement of something like qualitatively different. So anyways, all of this is in his book on class struggle. It's referenced also in Western Marxism. Let us now pivot back to the early Marx theory of the state and how this might dovetail with helping us think the contradictions of the contemporary capitalist state in the US.
Right. So I was actually really moved by this part of the essay. And you know, it was almost like I put in the work I'm writing now, I put like a paragraph on it, which is a little disassociative or digressive with respect to everything else. But I think it's clearly one of those things that could blossom into its own essay, and would require like a consultation of Gramsci as well. Because remember, we're about to talk about, just to be clear, and before we start, we're about to talk about, you know, how Losurdo frames the state and the advanced bourgeois state in this essay. And there are some parallels with the way Althusser does. But remember that Althusser's writings on the state were not available to him when I mean, there were certain things, but, you know, his famous writings on the state, ISAs, and so on, it wouldn't have been available to him when he wrote it. So it's very interesting on that level too. But in any case, what I found really interesting is, again, going back to the thing about the debate between Ruga and Marx, was this idea that the more advanced the state, the better it is at forms of ideological diffusion. You know, and I think in a way, you could say, well, this is already in Gramsci to some extent. But it's a little bit more complicated, I think, because of the way that Gramsci's work tends to be theorized in relation to the idea of passive revolution, right? Which accommodates, you know, the transformations that we were seeing in terms of, you know, the nascent welfare state or dirigism. But it's interesting when Marx talks about it, because Marx doesn't have the welfare state in mind, obviously, when he's in this debate in 1844. So he associates capitalism simply with deepening equality, right, to a large extent. And in that context, right, what becomes clear is that, you know, Marx sees England, right, as more ideological, right, than Germany at that time, which was less developed. In a way, you know, this got me thinking, because, like, you know, if you look at, like, what is the world's most advanced capitalist state today, right? Most people would say the United States is, right? Most advanced bourgeoisie, most advanced capitalist state. But it's also like, if you look at it, it's like so filled with these different ideological forms. You know, and I feel like these have metamorphosed in a way. So you could probably start to develop a kind of trajectory of those, right? Of course, we can talk about the 19th century. We know there was, you know, social gospel, social Darwinism, you know, over attribution to political parties and so on. But it's like, you know, today we see forms which are slightly different, right? So for example, like overinvestment in politics, obviously treating the superstructure as the base, not so different, not so new. But I mean, also like even identity, right? Which was a term that really didn't have much purchase in popular discourse until the 1950s. There was a great piece that was published in HM that dealt with sort of a genealogy of identity as a term. But you know, it's like both, because you have this in both the liberal left and the far right. I mean, the far right is worse for sure, right? But it's like it's the way that you know, identity comes to obscure the most fundamental contradiction in American society, right, which is between bourgeoisie and proletariat, especially in a developed capitalist state, right? So you know, like the liberal version of this would be something like what Adolf Reed talks about with Black Lives Matter, right? Which is like, you know, the main determinant of police violence isn't race, it's actually poverty, right? Now, poverty is racialized in the United States, right? But if you make it entirely, right, into a racial issue, then you're eliminating the possibility of a kind of cross-racial solidarity that could be very useful, or support for universal social programs, which have much more popular backing than, say, reparations. So Jay-Z and Beyonce get the reparations check or whatever. Of course, on the conservative side, right, you have a much more pernicious form of this, right, which is just like, you know, oh, you know, there's a problem. Okay, it's because we have non-Western labor in our country. Or, you know, even other pedophiles run the United States, right? You know, they're with the Democratic Party. We see this now. Not that there's not a rational kernel, you know, in the whole Epstein thing, but we see this now. You know, so it's like, you know, and I think this kind of, it's interesting. I think this sort of hysterical conspiracizing, and it's very interesting too, because like, I think this also is connected to some, you know, some of Jameson's ideas, right? Because the way that postmodernism becomes a kind of closure, right, where any notion of reality, right, you know, begins to disappear, any kind of referent which is outside discourse. And I think it was very interesting because, you know, when COVID happened, they did studies globally, and it's like, who are the most educated representatives of the most advanced capitalist societies in the world, right? Young people in the West, right? And I guess Japan, I don't know, whatever, right? Who are the people who are the most likely of any demographic in the world to believe in COVID conspiracies? Young people in the West. So how can it be the case that the most educated people in the entire world, the world's ever known, in the most advanced capitalist states, have the world's highest propensity, right, for outrageous subscription to conspiracy theories? And that is like a fascinating question to ask, but it also speaks to the way that education functions today, right? Because education, and this is also a kind of Jamesonian problematic, but education has become more and more, you see this with the attacks on humanities right now, like anything that might, you know, have the gall to put forth a kind of totalistic examination of society. Like, you know, education's needed for capitalist states, no doubt about it. Every developed society has a high level of education, but the focus has been on creating more and more technical education and denying people, you know, anything like a real ability to map reality at a broader level. And insofar as mapping is available to us at all, again, it's often like just hysterically ideological, right? You know, even this whole debate we're having about this is like, you know, not debate, but even this whole discussion we're having is symptom of the power of ideology. Because I was thinking a second ago when you were talking about, we were talking about Tronti and Losurdo, and like they put out Workers in Capital, like they put out Losurdo books, and everybody gets so mad, right? They're like, you can't do this. And then they put out Tronti, and he's like, oh, it's all that matter work, you know? And you know, in this industrial, which, you know, the West was industrial much more back then, of course. All that matters are workers, and by the way, fuck all post-industrial revolutions, and nobody complains, right? So again, you see, like, even within what we call Western Marxism, like how deeply ideologically conditioned,
Yeah.
you know, the whole perspective is on that level. So this is all I mean. It's like, I feel that, and I feel like it's also worse now than in the past, because, like, in a way, if in the period of, because if you have relative wealth redistribution, this was something I think that was sort of hinted at in the essay, but really, you know, but if you have relative redistribution, it's like, you know, in a way, at least on the domestic front, there are less social evils to conceal, right? So I don't know, maybe the debate there then becomes about, like, humanism, right? Like, that's the problem,
Yeah.
right? But I feel like what we're seeing now is, like, you know, we're witnessing a return to 19th century levels of inequality, and we're also witnessing a return to similarly odious ideas and forms of social chauvinism.
Yeah. So I guess,
And you can also see with imperialism,
right.
because the dissolution of the Soviet bloc, you know, has created, like, you had this attempt when the Soviet Union was there to use the rhetoric of, like, international order and human rights to
Mm-hmm.
counter communist
Mm-hmm.
expansion.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, since there's been more and more of this tendency, for the United States as the world's unambiguous most powerful nation
Yeah.
militarily, to simply override all, discard those mechanisms, right,
Right.
and revert to a kind of, almost like a kind of pre-liberal international order, almost
So I
unvarnished
guess, yeah.
imperialism.
Okay. So I guess the subtlety of the argument, just so comrades listening are clear, can kind of be summarized as follows, which is that the young Marx saw a fundamental interwovenness between civil society and the state, in which the measure and the power of the state is expressed through channels of civil society, agitation, representation, political sloganeering, what we would today call NGOs, grassroots civil societies, etc. But that becomes a kind of limited reflection of the bourgeois standpoint, which dominates the state, and the two are kind of interlinked and interdependent, and this creates a kind of interminable incapacity for civil society to possess the autonomy of a standpoint other than the bourgeois standpoint. The bourgeois standpoint kind of washes over civil society, right? And therefore, you get, I think, the natural conclusion from that. And of course, we saw this in as I articulate in my foreword to Flowers for Marx, the book, you know, Marx's famous break with the Communist League, with petty bourgeois ideologists who don't see the necessity to construct something other than that bourgeois civil society, right? Or something that would be in a different measure, a different relation of measure that would not be mirroring, unbeknownst to itself, right, the bourgeois standpoint. And I think what we're trying to say now is that part of the psychosis, if that's the right phrase, of American politics, right, expressed through conspiracy, expressed through this Jamesonian idea of the cognitive mapping, right, of the struggle to of citizens to sort of not only express their views politically, but to have a relationality between the expression of their views. Of course, expression is fully encouraged and it's saturated, it's oversaturated, and so on. All we have is expression. But we have this kind of psychosis over the struggle to forge institutions that would not be mirroring the bourgeois state interest, right? And this is something I think that is sort of the heart of what I'm getting at here, which is that at first blush, the American state would seem to be quite weak. But if we understand the state as a construct inextricable to the civil society, we actually now see the American state as like a much more thoroughly robust system of domination, right? That extends far beyond what we might think of normally as the deep state, or it's ultimately why I think this notion of deep state is not adequate, if that makes sense. So this is what I'm getting from this, which is that what's the consequences of thinking the interwovenness of civil society in the state, right? And I think the consequences are immense in a certain way. Is that how you're reading it? And what would you add to that?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that it's going to, in terms of consequences, that it pushes you in the direction of a certain kind of vanguardism, right? You know, because it's always like, you know, the breakdown, right, or the co-optation of these democratic processes that brings out that kind of critique of spontaneism. You know, and we see this in a sense prophesied with Kautsky's famous, you know, socialism comes from without, right? The idea it's brought to the workers, and it's the fusion that Marxism creates. Of course, we see that used in What Is to Be Done, and we see it as really crucial in the introduction to For Marx, to the way that Althusser frames his own project in terms of Marxist science. So I think
And
even
remember
later
this,
becomes more
remember,
critical of
just
that
as
formulation.
a quick side point, this is history and class consciousness, right? This is this idea that has been subsequently so abused of the standpoint of proletariat as, you could say, vanguard, but I'm not even sure that we should invoke this concept with all of its elitist baggage and all of that, which
Yeah.
and its post-Leninist abuses and so on and so on. But you see the point, though. It's about the break from petty bourgeois ideology and some type of subtraction. So please continue.
Right, right. And I also think that, you know, it's important to stress how powerful the American state is. Like, you know, like this is, and it's very interesting because Losurdo's points, I think in a way they're very prescient, right? You know, because what he's kind of talking about is the unreformability of the state. And of course, you can say, well, nothing too novel. This is part of Marxism, Leninism. It was affirmed by Maoism. But let us note, right, that he wrote this in 1970, right? You know, already at that time, we were seeing in a way the retraction of the Cultural Revolution, right? Also because there were beginning to be state concerns about it getting out of hand, right? 1973, you have the coup in Chile of Allende. Late 1970s, you have the beginning of Eurocommunism, which, you know, doesn't amount to a whole lot. You know, and then of course we can go on and discuss all these, but 2010s, right, left populism, right? So there's been like repeated attempts, right, to kind of capitalize on the radical democratic representational dimension,
Right.
that have failed. But I also think
and let's note that Losurdo is arguing that Marx, in the early period pre-1845, critique of Hegel's philosophy, you know, the German ideology, right? These seminal texts. He's claiming that there is an implicit critique of what we would today call radical democracy.
Yeah.
I just think that's extremely prescient and really nice.
Yes, 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 absolutely. But I think it's interesting because it anticipates some of Althusser's own later statements about the state. And one of my favorite quotes, I think it's in Koffer, which is this critique of Gramsci, not coincidentally, because it bears upon the notion of hegemony. And he says something to the effect of, like, contra the thesis of Gramsci, I would argue that the state is constructed in such a way so as to be completely oblivious to everything going on around it. Like, you can just say anything, right? Like, okay, it doesn't matter. And if you start to use that metric, then you're like, shit, the American state is incredibly powerful.
Exactly.
Right? Because it doesn't care what you think. Right? It's found a way to reproduce itself in a way that's so desensitized to democratic mechanisms, and yet still reproduces a sufficient level of consent function.
And exactly. And then the citizen is caught within the false universalism of its own projections, right? Which is the same point, which Marx would say, I think, very beautifully, that any nostalgic yearning of the citizenry, right, of civil society, for a fusion with community is equivalent to opium. It's delusionary. Yeah. It's superstitious. So there's a whole point about rationality and irrationality, right, of the bourgeois state itself, that civil society perpetuates an irrationality and a superstition, which is a beautiful idea in germinal form of like the phenomenon of, like, you know, InfoWars and the incoherence of conspiracy culture and QAnon, right?
Yeah, and I want to say as well. I want to say this as well, and this is sort of what I presented on when I was at Tsinghua University, which is beautiful. You know, it's like this is sort of the Oxford and Cambridge of China, right? Is Tsinghua and Beijing University in Beijing. And you know, when I was there, I went to a conference about different kinds of universalism. So it was sort of about, you know, how universalism has been reconceived over time in the context of socialist projects as well. You know, with respect to the East and the South and so on. And one point that I made, which I just think is important to stress, is that I think that, you know, about this thing about science, right? One thing that Losurdo says is, he says the exhortation to, he says, well, it may be true that the exhortation to humanism could be a problem or could lead to a limiting of class struggle. But he says the exhortation to science could as well. But in spite of this, in a way, you know, Losurdo sides himself kind of against this sort of Marxist science, you know, sort of humanism. And I think it's actually very interesting to note, because for me, if we look at the history of Marxism, you know, I think if you look at people we know, you know, Materials and Imperial Criticism by Lenin, you know, we know if you look at the work of Mao, he insists strongly on, you know, the needed rationalist dimension, right? You know, of class struggle, right? And we know that, you know, I always found it really interesting in Mao, because in Where Do Correct Ideas Come From, Mao, he says, well, you know, sometimes if an idea doesn't work, it doesn't mean it's not correct, right? You know, probably it'll eventually prevail, right? But you shouldn't abandon the idea just because it's not working. And I think what's really interesting, I'm kind of critiquing what I think, maybe a bit provocatively, I call practical reductionism. But I think you find this heavily, and I actually think it comes more from, interestingly, I think it comes more from Western Marxism. So I think that it was very common, right? If you look at dialectical materialism, if you look at kind of theology within Eastern Marxism, to, you know, maybe a little bit abductively, but to frame practice as a form of experiment, right? And to insist upon also, you know, Lenin says, like, matter is the condition of objective reality, right? And I think one of the things about this, you know, if we're talking about the advantages that can bequeath the class struggle, is that it keeps us as Marxists focused on, you know, these very fixed kind of goals, right? You know, we believe there's an objective reality, we believe it has to change in this way, and so forth. But I think that one thing that you begin to get, and it's particularly present within Gramsci, right, is you begin to get this idea that, well, you know, like predictions within Marxism, like maybe it doesn't really matter, right? Maybe it matters the friends we made along the way, right? Like, what is the utility of prediction, right? You know, for building coalition, right? You know, and he makes similar statements about the pretensions of Marxism in this way, right? But I think, you know, this can lead you in the direction of a somewhat intuit kind of populism. And of course, Gramsci had plenty of brilliant observations, right? But if you look at, you know, the history of Gramscianism, right, it's also continually associated, right, with reformism, right? So we see this with kind of the co-optation of his work by the Italian Communist Party, right, to justify kind of the social democratic turn after World War II. We see it with the Gramsci of the New Left, right? The kind of cultural Gramsci, right? We see it with the right Gramsci that was developed by de Benoist and so forth in France, Eurocommunism, right? Post-Marxism, right? Even left populism by extension, because we know it's MUF, right? Left populism, right? So I feel like, also this is one of those things, and this really gets back to, to a significant degree, because one thing we underestimate about there was, in a way, Althusser's sense of Marxist science was an attempt to defend the conception of dialectical materialism by reconceiving it, right? And dialectical materialism takes on a very meaning in his work, right? But I think he makes it clear that a big part of what, and you could maybe analogize it to Coletti in the sense, but a big part of what he's trying to defend is the idea that, no, like, there is something objective, right? There's an objective reality, there are objective class goals we have to pursue, right? There are relations of production, there are modes of production, and so forth, and we can't back away from that, right? And we should have, a somewhat puristic approach to that, right? But I think you can really see the way this the progressive relinquishing of these kind of categories that you see this within Laclau and Muff, for example, because what they want is a kind of radical representationalism, right, of the kind of diverse struggles within society, right? But in addition to probably not achieving the kind of larger economic matrix that we were discussing earlier, they also don't understand the way that those might explode the limits of representation itself, right, in a way. So it becomes kind of foreclosed, right, by the sort of radical democracy that Losurdo's critiquing at that stage. Now, could we argue that, in a way, that, Losurdo's own embrace of Hegel, that his own embrace of Gramsci succumbs to what Althusser was critical of in Gramscianism as well, right? Which was this kind of, residual, Hegelianism, whereby there's this sort of, progressive, conquest of the state. Okay, everything's going to be okay, right? Could we argue that from the standpoint of the defense of socialist states, that we might see a similar gesture within Losurdo, right? Who, will often stress the importance of the denunciation of dialectical materialism and the validity of it. Right.
In other words, this is evident to some extent in his book on Hegel and the Freedom of Moderns, where he tries to reveal that Marx, Engels, all the way up through Gramsci, everyone in the Marxist tradition tended to embrace the motto of the actualization of the real. The real is rational, the actual is real. That whole Hegelian idea, which leads to, according to the critics of Losurdo, ultimately a abuse or a kind of scandal, whereby the Marxist impetus on the withering of the state is no longer thinkable, no longer even prioritized. And my own view on that is that one has to contextualize, as I think we've tried to do throughout this stream, Losurdo's very, very interesting response to the disillusion of really existing communism in the USSR and the fallout from the Chinese Cultural Revolution, in order to really get at what he perceives as a sort of incapacity for Western Marxism in its own messianism to adequately address the problem of the state, right? And this kind of goes back to why one of our kind of contentions is that Losurdo's thought overall is becoming very useful to the contemporary left, is precisely that in our own conjuncture, the post-2010s failures of left populism and radical democracy have, I think, forced the radical left to face and seriously confront, to look in the mirror on this issue of subtraction from the machinery of the bourgeois civil society apparatus on the one hand, right? And then on the other hand, to change our relationship to existing socialist states, right? Losurdo permits us to think both of those things in a very robust way, right? And to reconceptualize the history of Marxism accordingly. The critics of Losurdo will say this is a grand repetition of some kind of Stalinism. I don't think that it is, personally. I think that that is an unreconstructed position that's too reliant on a Trotskyist interpretation of things in general, but it's also reliant on this specter of Stalinism, which I don't see as efficacious or as real as many Marxist thinkers do. So that's, I also recognize, Conrad, that I wanted to say a few things before we close our stream. We could spend more time on the Losurdo, the state, and all of that, but I'm going to shift, actually. So this is the Archimedean Point. This is Conrad and I's show to just talk about anything we want. And we're going to be doing a lot more of these. One of the things I always like to do is just get a feel for your latest work and even my own latest work in terms of writing. You've actually been writing quite a lot in addition to this essay you're working on that we've been talking about on the state and Marx. You also have recently written a nice review of Katerine Malibu's book on anarchism and philosophy, which is with Cosmonaut, and I'll post a link to it right now in the chat. I found this quite interesting. The book is called Stop Thief: Anarchism and Philosophy, and you seem to have gotten quite a lot out of it, but ultimately you have a lot of issues. Can you give us an overview here? I mean, perhaps there might be a way actually to dovetail some of these themes we've been talking about in the early Marx with Malibu's work here. And you also are a student of Malibu, who, if you're not aware, she's a very important Francophone philosopher trained by Jacques Derrida, extremely interesting reader of Hegel. Here's the link to Conrad's piece in the chat. Tell us about this book, how you found it.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, like, it's such a dense book that it's going to be like really, really, I mean, on some level, like, you really should are going to have to look at the review. I wouldn't say that I have criticisms of it that are too wide or anything. I mean, I think it's a great book. I think everybody should pick it up. And I think in a way it's like you would have to, I think the link and the way to understand it would be that we know that in terms of Malibu's anarchism, we know that way that Malibu wrote prominence was because of sort of deconstructive reading of Hegel. Her book, L'Avenir de l'Égal, the Hegel, famous, of course, 100-page preface by Jacques Derrida. But it offered quite a novel, reading of Hegel in terms of its, break with traditional, more dogmatic readings. I think also the great emphasis placed next on the little logic. And I share the view with her that the little logic is sort of wildly underrated as the kind of complete expression of Hegel's system. But she becomes associated with the idea of plasticity, right? Also an operative principle in terms of Hegel, which I think she becomes most known for this in the context of the way she uses it to mediate, the debate between philosophy and science. So in What Should We Do with Our Brains, one of the points she makes is that traditionally we've seen that, philosophy defends nurture, right, social determination, whereas science defends nature, that is biological determination. But she argues that with contemporary neuroscience, neuroplasticity, what you're seeing is that you can't really divide these things so easily, right? And I think in a way, if you want to look at how she approaches anarchism, I think that it's sort of evolving out of an attempt to expand these kind of researches into the field of politics, but to do so in a way that is quite transversal. So, one thing, if you look at, I also reviewed some years ago a collection that she did, Unchained Solidarity, and there she talks a little bit of Laclau and Mouffe. And I think in a way what attracts her to Laclau and Mouffe is, and Laclau and Mouffe are kind of post-Althusserian, in a way, but it's the way that, you know, they carry through this kind of Althuserian dimension of the overdetermined contradiction in a way, but they relinquish any kind of narrow conception of economic determination. As a Marxist, of course, I do believe in economic determination, but I think the idea is to realize plasticity at the level of social analysis, you know, and that anarchism might be the thinking that's most disposed to achieving that. But that having been said, when it comes to this book, and this book contains, you know, really quite irreducible and in-depth analyses of like 6 thinkers. So there's like Rainer Sherman, Foucault, Derrida, Levinas, Rancière. Who am I missing here? And right, Agamben, right? And I'm not, by the way, I'm not going to attempt to reduce all of those. But to be clear about this book, actually, it's interesting because in the book, she, you know, she's not focused on classical anarchism as much. I mean, she did talk before about Kropotkin and his theory of mutual aid, which I do think is quite fascinating. Also, these interesting aporias about nature and nurture. But she's talking about what she terms post-anarchism, right? And Sherman, you know, would be the one most associated with that term. But post-anarchism in general, right, it kind of emerges, I think, from the impetus of kind of the work of Michel Foucault. So the critique of traditional anarchism would be that it's a kind of statism, right? So, okay, we get rid of the state, everything's okay, right? Whereas post-anarchism is much more invested in trying to negotiate, right, kind of the whole, you know, structure of power differentials, if you will, and how they function, right? And we to a mere extinguishing of the state. I will say finally, yeah. So, you know, I think the book's great. I think it's a brilliant attempt to rethink anarchism. I'm not an anarchist, but I do think that this one's worth reading. And I do think it's going to be something that, you know, is ultimately kind of part of the canon of anarchism. So I know that her work, you know, maybe hasn't been getting as much attention as some of her previous work on science and things like that. But I suspect that when the dust settles, we're going to put her up there with the Chomsky and the Goldmans, and, you know.
Interesting. That's really cool. Yeah, that's.
But
really
I will say just finally about the book. I will say my sort of critique, which is really just a critique of the last few pages, is that you know, I'm not. She sort of talks a little bit about politics at the end of the book, you know, and I wasn't entirely sold on the way that she approaches it. She talks about, I believe, is it Audrey Tang? She talks about a Chinese hacker here, and this person had kind of worked within government to encourage, like, you know, kind of hackathons to help improve government services and things of this nature. And I mean, like, at this point, you're kind of wondering, you're like, okay, well, what kind of political project are we talking about? And she does raise the question. She's like, you know, is this something bold and innovative? Is it just another form of state co-optation? But I think it mirrors the bigger dilemma that she's kind of against, you know, trying to achieve credit within anarchist circles, because she's not historically associated with politics. So I think a lot of people are like, is this just this aloof French philosopher? Is this like, you know, or is this for real? And maybe politically, there's a certain kind of a lack of experience in that field that, you know, prevents her from linking up the richness of the philosophical critiques to a more tangible political project. But I also think that it's something that, you know, could have a lot of utility for anarchist projects in the future, right? You know, in terms of negotiating how it's going to link with politics in that way.
Okay, great. Well, comrades, I am headed to a baseball game, so we gotta conclude our stream. There's this concept from Lacanian psychoanalysis called a scansion point, which is that Lacan believed that in analysis, it's best to end abruptly. So you send a signal to the analysand's unconscious that what they were talking about has meaning when you interrupt them and you stop abruptly. So I'm not too abruptly, but I don't want to be late for my engagement this afternoon. But there's a lot more for us to discuss. Conrad has several things. I've actually written a new piece forthcoming in a Russian journal on Althusser, an ideology, where I look at kind of lesser known Althusserian disciple who's, I think, the most communist of the Althusserian school, although he's not, again, he's not talked about too much. His name, Péchot, is a very interesting figure. I write about him. And then I have a piece forthcoming in the European Journal of Psychoanalysis on the Freudian theory of aesthetics and daydreaming. So that's something that comrades can look forward to. But I think in future Archimedean Points, we will dig in more to our writing and our work. We'll talk about these things in more detail. I want to encourage comrades to, again, do everything they can to support the crisis in Gaza, which we opened with and we talked about. Find a trusted charitable source to provide any financial support you can at this moment. This is a true tipping point. Famine, hunger is reaching a boiling point, and we absolutely need an immediate ceasefire. Just want to say that because we've been talking in abstractions and philosophy, which of course is essential and good, but we can't lose sight of that reality. So sorry to cut the stream a little bit short, comrades, but this has been a lot of fun. Do you have any final words for us, Conrad?
Yeah, solidarity to what's going on in Gaza, and yeah, that's all I got.
Yes, indeed. And people are asking, do we have critiques of Leclau and Mouffe? I wrote one great critique of Leclau and Mouffe I just would recommend as a sort of just to respond to that is in Isabel Garo's Communism and Strategy. Fabulous critique. I wrote a review in Spectre. You can look it up, called Renewing Political Marxism. I think it's very, very sound. It's worth looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I feel like the problem with Muff in a way is that they always, to me, they make problems which are immanent and historical into philosophical problems in a way, so it's like economic determination is a way for understanding capitalism, right? It's not a philosophical proposition.
Well, also,
right?
There's also this claim that's kind of the reverse of Althusser, whereby Leclau actually wrote his dissertation arguing that the error of the workers' movement was its class reductionism. And what that ends up leading to for Leclau is the view that capitalism is untranscendable, ultimately. So the fundamental contradiction between capital and wage labor, or even the proposition that wage labor can be abolished and prioritized, is kind of thrown out, I mean, it is paradoxically where Zizek actually wins in his debate with Leclau, even though Zizek has a lot of other problems that's separate. But I think there's a lot of very relevant critiques of Leclau that we could point to. But
so I would say, for the sake of balance, I would say read that critique of Leclau and Mouffe, and then read Malibu's book, which is Genius, where she uses Leclau and Mouffe, and then I think you'll maybe get a good different perspective.
All right, very cool. All right, thanks again, comrades. Until next time.